They walked in like they owned the place, smiling as if the hardwood floors and the big windows belonged to them, and my throat closed. I'm a man who tells stories, so I know how a scene reads: the quiet before a confession, the polite laugh before a knife, and this one felt like all the nights I'd replayed in a bad dream. Rachel's hand stroked a countertop like she was already planning where the kids would sleep. Mom glanced at the built-ins like a banker checking a ledger, and Tyler hovered with that awkward, guilty smile that never fooled anyone. My chest hammered so hard I thought my heart would punch right through my ribs. I wanted to say something sharp and beautiful and ruin everything perfectly, but I'd learned to measure words like a programmer measures each line of code: precise, necessary, and lethal when needed. I kept my hands where they couldn't betray me, one on the doorframe, the other in my coat pocket, pretending to be casual while every memory from my broke, hungry 20s came back in vivid, stupid detail. I could see the parking lot where I'd slept in my car, the bright sodium lights like a cruel sun. I could taste instant ramen and cheap coffee. I felt the cold of library floors where a professor found me and refused to let me vanish. They were polite, saying, "We're so proud of you," like they'd never once emptied my future into someone else's casserole. I told myself I was beyond needing to prove anything to them, but the old knot in my gut tightened anyway. You don't get $1 million house by being fragile. You get it by getting angry for the right reasons and turning that anger into something you control. Rachel started a tour without asking, like a realtor with entitlement in her veins, moving from room to room listing off imaginary furniture and modifications. "This would be perfect for the kids," she said, voice airy like a ribbon pulled over a wound. Mom nodded in the background, and that bright, rehearsed pride they shared felt like a mockery. I could see every calculus of their lives that had once involved me disappearing. The stolen loans, the forged signatures, the petty decisions that look reasonable when you're pointing them at someone else's future. I'd tried for years to be the bigger person, paying off debts, fixing my credit, pretending the family was salvageable. But the evidence I'd compiled was a slow-burning ember I could light whenever I wanted. Today I chose to flare it up into flames. "Welcome to my house," I said, and kept my voice steady even though my mouth wanted to spit lists of names and crimes. I watched them freeze, those smiles wobbling like actors caught off script. Tyler, who had always been the good guy in family narratives, looked oddly small under the pendant lamp. "We're so proud," he managed, then trailed off. I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears, counting out the beats that had made the difference between living in a car and owning hardwood floors. "You look happy," Mom said, and I wondered whether she heard the accusation in my tone or just how she'd trained herself to misread winters as springs. I didn't let them drift into comfort. I pulled out the laptop and walked them to the dining room where the big screen could make private things public. I felt ridiculous and liberated at the same time, like someone who'd been taught to steal from you now deciding to bring the receipts to dinner. Sliding the first document into view felt almost childish: credit reports, bank transfers, loan applications with a myriad of sloppy forgeries I kept because I am a man who plans for the worst even when he wants the best. Their faces changed the way masks do when light hits them. Rachel's composure cracked. Mom's defense system blinked into overdrive. Tyler tried to look confused and worried the way people do when they first feel guilty. "Where did you get this?" Mom asked, voice ticking like a clock moving too fast. I answered calmly, telling them where a little stubbornness, a private investigator, and sleepless nights had led me. I watched as Tyler's fake innocence collapsed into real shame. He kept saying, "I didn't know," like that absolved him of a ledger full of transfers and excuses. Rachel's hands went white on the kitchen chair. I saw in her face a child who had been taught to always get what she wanted, and a woman finally seeing the cost of that education. I offered a choice because I'd learned giving ultimatums is not the same as revenge. I wasn't taking the house back and I wasn't giving them charity, but I would create safe, locked scholarships for those kids, accounts they could never touch. I told them I'd be present in their lives on my terms, not theirs. Mom's protest was immediate and loud, the old scripts firing like a broken record about family and duty. I let it run out, then closed the laptop like a judge striking a gavel. The room felt different after that, purged and raw in a way that didn't soften into forgiveness. This wasn't a victory celebration, it was a verdict, and I didn't expect apologies to fix what they'd broken, but I did expect ownership of consequences. When they left, it wasn't theatrical: no slammed doors, no sobbing embraces, just a slow stacking of silence and shoes at the threshold. After the click of the lock, that old knot in my gut loosened, not into relief but into steady resolve. I poured myself a cheap drink and walked through the rooms they had inspected, touching the banister that once would have felt like a luxury and now felt like proof. I had built this life by refusing to be erased, and I would defend it with every unapologetic truth I'd learned how to speak. I remember Cleveland like a stage set. Familiar houses, tired streets, my father doing numbers in an office, my mother running a little boutique with good gossip and thin invoices. I am a man who remembers faces and patterns, and I watched our family pretend normal while the seams pulled apart. On the surface, everything looked fine. Dad in his calm suit, Mom bustling about a small shop, and Rachel wearing that easy halo of favoritism everyone gave her. But the truth was messy beneath the smiles, and I learned early to read what people refused to say out loud. When I was 13, Dad left, and nothing dramatic happened in public. No shouting scenes, no slammed doors for the neighbors to whisper about, but it rearranged how we lived. Divorce isn't always cinema. Sometimes it's a slow drip that empties a house of chances. Dad moved to Chicago and rebuilt a life I barely heard about. Mom stayed behind and tightened the rules in ways that always made me the one who could stretch. Rachel married Tyler, and their wedding cost more than $65,000 because Mom said a daughter only gets married once. I watched them spend like it was sacred, while I worked every spare hour and learned the exact weight of somebody else's priority. Rachel and Tyler had kids soon after, Noah, Claire, and Milo. With each child, the entitlement grew not just in Rachel but in the whole household's expectation that music would play while Mama sacrificed. Mom would say, "Your sister has 3 kids to feed," and that sentence became an ordinance in our home. I took extra shifts at the coffee shop, sat in the library until the lights dimmed, and learned to hide the empty fridge behind a smile. I kept a 4 because I thought merit would be armor. It kept me fed in arguments because then I was reasonable and capable, and could therefore be asked to give more. I got good at being invisible and useful, at carrying burdens that didn't fit me. People think surviving means being loud about scars. I learned the opposite. I became the person who fixed things and forgave things because forgiveness felt like survival. I baked casseroles for Rachel's house. I let her kids sleep over. I tutored friends and neighbors for pennies. I learned to translate my needs into other people's priorities so they wouldn't notice I had needs at all. That kind of erasure isn't noble. It's a slow theft of a life you were supposed to get to live. Then my 19th birthday arrived, and the world turned in a single, predictable way that I should have seen coming. Mom and Rachel sat at the kitchen table with the lights low and papers spread, and I walked into that calm like someone walking into a staged accident. They asked me to hand over my college fund. They didn't ask like reasonable people asking for help. They asked like judges explaining sentences. "Rachel needs a 4-bedroom now," Mom said, and Rachel added, "Tyler's bonus won't cover the move." They had already decided. The money Dad set aside for me was suddenly a resource for fixing their life. My chest hollowed out in a way that made me dizzy. I remember the exact frozen feeling, that particular type of disbelief that you can't argue with because arguing doesn't fit their plan. Rachel said, "You have scholarships." Like that closed the conversation, and Mom told me to be practical because the kids needed stability. I had been practical my whole life. Practicality had a name and a face in my family, and it was always mine. But in that moment, something in me that had been patient and patient and patient finally refused to be patient again. I told them I would pack my bags. Saying it felt like stepping off a cliff, but stepping is not the same as falling. I slept in my car that night in a big box parking lot, my jacket for a pillow and humiliation beside me like a companion. For 17 days I lived on hustle and silence, 3 jobs, showers at the gym, library, naps. I was the textbook definition of someone clawing air in the dark, but I wasn't pitying myself. I was learning how to rely on people who actually wanted to help me rise. Professor Marjorie Cole found me and she didn't lecture. She gave me a room and a chance, and because of her, I found a path out of the place where family had expected me to disappear. That choice, to refuse invisibility and to accept help when it came honestly, set me on a route to owning my life and many years later this house. They had the kitchen light low like a quiet conspiracy, papers spread like proof, and when I opened the door their heads barely lifted. I stood there with my bag in my hand and watched the 2 people who raised me treat my future like a spreadsheet line they could move around. The numbers were already circled and annotated. They had mapped out how my college fund would patch a hole in Rachel and Tyler's plan. I wanted to say something that would make them feel small, but I kept my voice level because I knew rage said more when it was steady. I asked questions, but they were patient answers meant to close the conversation, not open it. They told me Tyler's bonus came up short and that Rachel needed a 4-bedroom now, and the way they spoke made it clear they had already decided my dreams were negotiable. "You've got scholarships," Rachel said like it was a gentle mercy, as if loans and transfer apps were the thing that would make my life okay. Mom sat there, pinching the bridge of her nose the way people do when they feel justified. I tried to explain that scholarships didn't cover everything and that the money Dad had set aside was intended for me, but my words hit the same wall whatever tone I used. Their faces were calm and certain, the same faces that had asked me to be invisible my whole life. Then Mom stood and gave me the ultimatum like it was simple business. Her hand made a small, final gesture and she said, "Hand the money over or leave." I felt the air go thin around me, like someone had turned a valve and let the world drain. I had spent years being practical and small because that's what my family expected, and that practicality had a cost measured in missed chances. But in that moment, the idea of handing over what little future I had left felt like handing them the map of my life and watching them burn it. Something in me broke and made space for a kind of stubbornness I hadn't seen before. Packing felt both rushed and deliberate. I put clothes in a duffel, grabbed my laptop and the few papers that mattered and left without a fight. Nobody stopped me at the door. No last-minute pleas, no dramatic apologies, just a house that had decided my role for me. I walked to my car with my heart pounding and my head full of every night I'd worked instead of sleeping, every smile I had used to hide worry, every promise I'd kept to other people first. The parking lot that night was big and empty, a sea of fluorescent lights and a sense that I had stepped away from everything familiar. Sleeping in the car felt like an ending at first, like the world had folded up around me and refused to let me in. My back ached from seats not meant for sleep. The jacket under my head did little to stop the cold, and embarrassment sat like a stone in my stomach. But even in that small, awful place, I found a strange clarity. I thought about the lectures I had sat through, the professor who looked at me with real concern, and the stack of admissions letters that felt like lifelines. The night was ugly, but it made one thing very clear. I could either let them erase me or I could start building from the grit. For the next 17 days, I lived a steady, exhausted rhythm of work and hope. I picked up early shifts at the coffee shop, worked the IT help desk late into the night, and did freelance data entry gigs on weekends. I showered at the gym and ate whatever kept my engine running, and I learned quickly how to clip together hours and money until they formed something like stability. There was no pity in my days. I treated every job like a step away from being erased. I learned how to fold my life into pockets of time and make each hour pay rent on a future. I refused to let the shame of those nights be the end of the story. On day 17, I fell asleep at my study table in the campus library and woke to a hand on my shoulder and a voice that sounded like the real world handing me a rope. Professor Marjorie Cole didn't scold or pity me, she listened and then made a choice to help. She drove me to her house, gave me a room, and set other things in motion without making it about heroics. She wrote recommendations, called financial aid offices, and treated me like someone worth investing in. Her kindness cut through the loneliness like light through fog. And because of that small, stubborn chain of help, I found doors that weren't there when I slept in that car. Sleeping in that parking lot felt like the end of everything at first, but it turned out to be the start of something else. It made me stop pretending the scraps of my life were enough and forced me to accept help that wasn't meant to keep me small. From that cramped, cold beginning, I kept moving forward, learning who deserved my loyalty and who had used it as a wage. That choice to refuse to be invisible became the hinge the rest of my life swung on. Professor Marjorie Cole finding me in the library felt like someone throwing a rope to a drowning man, and I say that because I am a man who still remembers the exact weight of desperation. She woke me gently, handed me a travel mug, and when I told her I had nowhere to go, she didn't lecture. She drove me to her house, set me up in a spare room, and treated me like I mattered in a way nobody at home ever had. Her spare room smelled like old books and lemon cleaner, and sleeping under that ceiling for the first time in weeks felt like permission to breathe again. I learned fast that help is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's a warm bed and someone who writes a scholarship recommendation without asking for a medal. Professor Cole didn't just give me a room, she opened doors. She sat with me through financial aid forms and called administrators herself when bureaucracy tried to fold me under. She pushed me into interviews and called out my tendency to underplay my worth. "You are not a charity case," she told me one night over a stack of application papers, and the bluntness of it stuck. It was the kind of hard kindness I needed, equal parts challenge and steadiness. Because of her work, I got additional aid and a campus job that actually matched my skills. I took it like a man who knows how to count hours and make them pay for something real. I enrolled at the State University in the computer science program with nothing but stubborn optimism and a backpack full of hope. I worked the IT help desk, waited tables, freelanced odd jobs, and kept my grades like they were the last clean shirt in a suitcase. Nights were a blur of coding assignments, coffee, and the sound of plates hitting counters at the diner. Weekends were freelancing marathons where I fixed other people's tech for cash I would fold into rent and groceries. I told myself sacrifice was temporary and worth it. I told myself I was building a life instead of losing one. I remained precise and relentless, the habits of a man who had learned discipline the hard way. Then I met Mia Nguyen in a lab late at night when the building smelled like solder and stale pizza. She burst into the workspace with ideas that sounded like fireworks and opinions that took up more room than the floor plan allowed. She was impulsive and brilliant in a way that made my checklist brain stutter. I am a man who likes plans and systems, and I watched her sketch interfaces with a reckless joy that made the code feel alive. Our partnership was a weird kind of symmetry. Her chaos met my order and something useful happened. We worked through disagreements with bad coffee and worse tempers, but the thing we built between us was a steady tug towards something better. We started talking about real problems, not the ones people pontificated about, but the ones we'd watched people live through: overdraft fees, surprise rent, the shame of not making ends meet. We sketched an app one night on a napkin, wrote a simple prototype the next week, and called it Beacon because we wanted it to be that, a small, steady light for people stuck in financial fog. Beacon was lean and scrappy, a way to track income, set small goals, and warn users when bills were coming, like a friend whispering a plan in your ear. We thought small at first because that's what money teaches you: think small and survive. But we wanted real change, not just band-aids. Living while building Beacon was a lesson in humility. Mia and I shared a tiny, rundown flat with one window and a sink that never drained right. The place had paint peeling like old scabs, and sometimes the heater grunted like it was alive and tired. We slept on a couch one month when the landlord decided to renovate the bedroom, and we paid for microwave dinners with wire transfers from our freelance clients. We argued about priorities: should we spend on hosting a demo or on groceries, then made the hard, hungry choice that most startups make and pushed the demo. There were nights we both fell asleep at the keyboard, her design files open, my backend scripts running like small heartbeats. People romanticize those nights, but they are more about grind than glamour. Beacon grew because we stayed at it when most people would have quit, because we listened to users who told us what actually hurt and then fixed it. I learned that resilience isn't an abstract virtue. It's getting up to a 5 a.m. shift after working until midnight and learning a new framework before class. Mia taught me to take risks with product features. I taught her to measure the risk and make sure it paid off. We were messy, stubborn, and relentless, and the combination made something people wanted. From that rundown flat and a string of bad coffee came the first real step toward a life I'd been told I didn't deserve, and every line of code felt like a stitch in the life I was finally making mine. Rejection became our daily weather for months, and I learned to carry disappointment like a mechanic carries tools, folded, useful, and always at hand. I remember the pitch meetings that ended with polite nods and the emails that read, "Thanks, but not right now." Every no stacked up until it looked like proof we were fools, but Mia and I treated each rejection as data. We fixed the product, tuned the messaging, and kept showing up. Persistence felt less like a virtue and more like a stubborn muscle we had to refuse to stop training. People tell you grit is noble. I tell you grit smells like cold coffee and unpaid invoices. Then, by an odd combination of timing and dumb luck, a small grant landed in our inbox. It wasn't much, but it was leverage. We used that money the way you use a plane ticket to get somewhere different. We hired a marketer who actually understood the mess Beacon was trying to organize, someone who could read our users' shame and publish it like a map. The marketer wrote a blog piece that reframed Beacon not as another finance app, but as a tool that treated struggling people like adults, not liabilities. The piece hit the right people, and then a financial influencer with a big following wrote about us in one honest paragraph that felt like sunlight on damp earth. Downloads spiked overnight, and the servers groaned under new traffic like a city waking early. From there, Beacon grew the way things do when they finally find oxygen. We were still messy behind the scenes: arguments about feature priorities, awkward payroll conversations, and Mia sleeping under her desk during a release. But the user numbers climbed in a way that meant we could hire steady help and stop patching everything with duct tape. Our core feature set stayed simple and honest: automatic reminders, small savings goals, and a community feature where users shared survival hacks instead of polished success stories. People trusted us because Beacon didn't preach, it planned. It felt like someone had taught a million people how to put one brick down at a time instead of promising them a mansion. Hundreds of thousands of users turned into millions over a few years, and that growth made us visible to bigger players. I learned interesting, ugly things about how money chases what looks safe and scalable, and a large fintech company offered to buy Beacon. The offer looked ordinary on paper but seismic in my chest. I sat with Mia and our small team in a room that smelled like takeout and printer toner, and we argued like people arguing about whether to sell a piece of their soul. Some of the criticism was fair. Some of it came from people who think tech fixes everything and don't want to see the lives behind the numbers. In the end, We said yes because the acquisition would let Beacon scale and keep its mission alive in a way we couldn't do alone. The payout changed my world, but not how people assumed. I didn't blow it on luxuries or spite. I invested most of it with the same careful attention I'd used coding Beacon's backend: diversify, hedge, and don't panic when markets huff and puff. I set up scholarships for first-generation students because the professor who saved me didn't get a plaque. She got my belief turned into funds. I seeded community grants for small civic tech projects that help people with practical things: housing searches, benefits navigation, and local job boards, because I never forgot what being locked out felt like. I bought a house too, and that choice tasted like victory and bitterness mixed together. It was a Craftsman with wide windows, hardwood floors, and a porch that felt like a promise I'd made to myself when I was cold in a parking lot. I know some people will say I should have forgiven faster or that I held grudges too long, and maybe they're right in the neat moralizing way people like. But forgiveness doesn't mean letting people take your life, boundaries do. Buying the house was not a punishment, it was a reclamation. It was proof that someone who had been told to be small could build something real without traffic in bitterness as currency. The house was a testament to code written at 2 a.m., to unpaid internships turned into paying jobs, to nights of ramen turned into steady meals, and to every time I chose to make a plan instead of a plea. I put keys on my fridge and framed a few scholarship letters on the wall like postcards from the future. I still argued with money, still worried about markets, and still chewed on the odd uncomfortable choices startup life forces on you. But watching Beacon help people, strangers who sent messages about how a reminder saved their rent payment or how a small saving goal bought a child's shoes, felt like the kind of success you can carry without shame. It didn't erase the past, and it didn't excuse the people who hurt me, but it gave me room to breathe and a platform to try to make things less cruel for people who grew up where I did. The first thing Dad said when he sat down across from me was a crooked, honest sort of sorry, and I felt both relief and a fresh ache at once. I am a man who tells stories, and this one had an ending I'd imagined 100 ways, but not like this quiet. He'd seen the Beacon acquisition headlines and wanted to meet, like someone peeking back in after years of shame. He told me he'd known about the college fund theft and felt trapped and powerless to stop it. Hearing that made a raw corner of me soften and harden at the same time. Soft because he finally said it. Hard because saying it had taken so long and the cost had been mine. Dad looked older and smaller than the last time I'd seen him, like life had taken a few inches from his shoulders. He told me about his new life in Chicago, the job he'd kept for stability, and how guilt had been its own kind of prison. He admitted he'd been ashamed to confront Mom and Rachel, afraid of breaking the kids' lives, and so he stayed quiet. I listened because you can only judge a man who speaks when you understand the fear that stopped him. He also admitted Rachel and Tyler were struggling again after some layoffs and bad investments, and that confession stung in a different place. Part of me wanted to pity them. Part of me remembered the nights my future got traded for a down payment. I invited them to my housewarming because I wanted closure, or at least to see if the family script could change. I wanted to test whether someone who had been burned could learn to trust without getting scorched again. The party began the way parties do when you pretend everything is fine. Laughter, clinking glasses, Professor Cole hovering in the doorway like a guardian angel who'd seen the story through, neighbors complimenting the floors, and friends swapping blown-out startup war stories. The house felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with central heating. It was the kind of warmth that comes from building a life with sweat and deliberate choices. People mingled, Mia and I quietly proud at opposite ends of a room filled with evidence our work had shipped, and I made a short, measured speech thanking those who had helped me. I watched Dad talk to an old colleague and felt the floor stay steady under me for the first time in years. Then Rachel stood up like she'd rehearsed it, placed her hand on my arm and said, "As Lena's sister, this home would be perfect for my family." The room went still the way enclosed spaces do when someone drops a heavy book on the table. I am a man who knows the weight of a sentence, and that one landed harder than anything else that night because it smelled exactly like the old bargains. Everything in me did a quick inventory. Memories of scraping by while she celebrated, the forged loans, the nights I slept in a car, and the quiet work it took to reach this porch swing. I watched her smile while she listed reasons why it fit their needs, why Tyler's job couldn't handle renovations, why the kids needed a yard, and it all sounded like entitlement wrapped in polite language. People shifted in their seats, eyes moving between us like they were trying to judge whether to intervene or sip their wine silently. Mom nodded in the background, that practiced expression she wears when she's explaining why someone must sacrifice. The air tasted like glass. I didn't explode. I don't tell stories that end with blind rage for drama. I tell stories that cut. I opened my laptop and I let the room see the bad math that had eaten my 20s. Bank statements, forged loan documents, and transaction histories that traced money straight into accounts linked to Rachel and Tyler. Watching their faces change was a kind of brutal catharsis. Rachel's composure unfurled into something raw, Mom's defenses flicked on and off like a faulty circuit, and Tyler looked like a man finally seeing the trail his choices left behind. I laid out what I had paid for secretly, the late hours, the second jobs, the small acts of survival that had kept the credit clean while I quietly fixed what was broken. I offered a boundary instead of a battle. I told them the house was mine and would stay mine because this was the life I'd fought to build. But I also said I would set up locked educational accounts for Noah, Claire, and Milo, money they could not touch unless it was for school expenses, and I would be in their lives on terms that protected my hard-won space. Mom sputtered about family and duty, words that in her mouth had always meant I should be the one who gave. Rachel cried, then snapped that she didn't want charity. Tyler apologized in a low voice that felt real in the way some apologies do. It's a small thing to admit when you finally see the damage. They left without a slam, an anticlimax that felt engineered. After the door clicked closed, the house exhaled and so did I, but it wasn't relief in the way people expect. It was steadier, like a machine warmed to work. I sat on the porch swing with a glass of water and watched the light change, thinking about the strange altar of family where loyalty had sometimes been weaponized. Reconnecting with Dad had given me some of what I wanted: honesty, awkward apologies, and slow rebuilding. But it had also shown me that love and harm can live in the same room. I slept that night with the keys on the table, a small, private victory that felt messy and utterly mine. I snapped the laptop shut and then opened it again like someone pulling a lever, and the room leaned in without knowing why. I am a man who learned to make evidence speak when words would be swallowed, so I connected my phone to the TV and watched the light fill the dining room. The first slide was the protective order I'd filed years before, the legal paper that once felt like armor, and when it came up the air in the room went colder. People glanced at each other and the polite chatter thinned. I felt steady and terrible at the same time. Steady because truth lined up like soldiers, terrible because truth can break things you used to call family. I clicked through police reports next, neat pages stamped with dates and case numbers that matched my story. My hands didn't shake. I'd carried those pages in my wallet for years like a confession and a compass. Then the credit statements appeared, lines and numbers that told a story in a language my family had tried to deny. There were 3 new credit cards and a personal loan opened in my name for just over $58,000, all showing activity right after I left the house at 19. Seeing the numbers felt like watching a replay of a theft, the same rhythm I'd lived through when I'd been too young and too trusting. The transfers were the worst part to show because numbers mapped to people. I traced the money trail through bank statements and clicked a transfer that landed in an account tied to a card Rachel used often. Another went to a joint account that flagged for transfers to Tyler's listed vendor payments. It was blunt, boring, and damning the way spreadsheets can be. I had spent 3 years quietly paying off that debt while working extra shifts and taking freelance gigs, because I hoped prosecution would hurt my family further than repair. I had forgiven a lot because I wanted us to be a family again, and that slow forgiveness had cost me a decade of easier choices. "Where did you get this?" Mom asked first, but the question hung like a child reaching for a fragile glass. Her voice shifted between denial and the practiced calm that had once made me shrink. I watched her face pivot from disbelief to bargaining in a matter of seconds, a small human theater of justification. "We did what we had to," she said, as if pen strokes could become reasons. It made bile rise in my throat. I am a man who remembers being told to be practical until there was nothing left to practice on. Her defenses were quick and familiar, the same lines used when guilt needed dressing. Rachel didn't look like someone defending a mistake, she looked like someone defending survival. Her voice broke into fragments of explanation. It was desperation. Tyler's job was unstable. Mom pressured me. It was the same pattern I'd heard my whole life: blame the moment instead of the choice. She held my gaze and tried to make me see the needs behind the theft, and part of me, the younger, exhausted part, wanted to nod because people are complicated and hungry and sometimes make terrible calls. But evidence is a blunt instrument against sentiment, and when you've been hollowed out by someone else's choices, you learn it's safer to trust proof than pity. Tyler said I didn't know. He sounded small, not defensive, and the change in his face made the room tilt. He moved his hands as if to rearrange the air. I could see shame live in him, a real raw thing that washed out color. Whether he had known or not, the transfers hit accounts connected to his life, and that fact settled like dust around us. Dad's apology came slow and broken. He said he'd felt trapped, that he'd seen signs and been too ashamed to fight. His words were a late, thin bandage, but they were something, and I took them because I am a man who knows how little good is wasted. I told them what I had decided before the noise of their arguments grew into old songs. I said I wouldn't give them the house, that the house was the result of years of grinding and failure and small victories that I wouldn't trade away. But I said I wouldn't turn my back on the kids either. I would set up locked education funds for Noah, Claire, and Milo, accounts that could only be used for tuition, books, and school fees, and I would be present for them on terms that didn't let my life be collateral. Mom argued about family duty and how these arrangements were cruel. Rachel accused me of charity as punishment. I let them talk and then stood firm. When the party of friends and colleagues watched this private truth, the room changed into a courtroom without a judge. People shifted, discomfort making polite exits. The heavy part wasn't proving anything, it was deciding how to keep love without letting it be a weapon. I felt the old knot ache, but this time I had a boundary line I wouldn't cross. I had paid the debt, set the facts down, and chosen where I would put my heart, with the kids, not with the theft. As they left, grappling with blame and with apologies that were half true, I realized that owning the truth had not made things simple, only honest. The air after the confrontation felt like a held breath finally let go, and it took weeks for the quiet to mean something other than tension. I am a man who watches consequences spread like ripples, and our family rippled slowly back into a new shape. Tyler moved out and eventually told me quietly that he couldn't stay in a marriage built on that kind of secret. He apologized in a way that looked like work, steady, practical steps rather than grand gestures, and he showed up where it mattered. For the kids, for the calls that were about homework and doctor's visits, not money. That kind of apology is rare, and I watched it do small repairs to a life that had been frayed. Rachel's path was messier and more honest than any tidy story I'd hoped for. Therapy started as something she resisted, then came like surgery, painful and necessary. She took a modest job at a local nonprofit and for the first time in years had to budget and survive without being rescued. She stumbled and cursed and then learned how to shop with a list and how to say no. Watching someone go from insisting on being owed everything to learning how to earn quiet dignity is unpleasant and beautiful at the same time. She cried to me about shame, and then showed up to parent-teacher nights with a backpack that didn't smell like entitlement anymore. I learned to accept progress that arrived in small, unglamorous increments. Mom was the hardest to read. She vacillated like weather over Lake Erie, sometimes sunny remorse, sometimes a storm of defensive reasons. She would offer apologies that folded quickly back into explanations about family needs and sacrifice. With Dr. Jennifer Blake's guidance in my ear, I learned to accept apologies that were real and to set firm limits when words circled back to old habits. My therapist taught me that boundaries are not punishments, they are declarations of what you will allow into your life. I used simple rules: no loans, no shared accounts, and no demands for my money. Those rules kept me sane and allowed me to be present without being played. I focused on the kids because they never asked for adult-sized mistakes, they only wanted someone steady. I set up educational-only accounts for Noah, Claire, and Milo, locked funds that could only be used for tuition, books, or school-related fees. I made them accounts they couldn't touch for dinners or toys precisely because I wanted their future to be guarded against the impulse to extract. People called it dramatic. Others called it necessary. I call it keeping promises to myself and to the people who deserved better than what their parents had given them. I also started mentoring Noah in coding because he was curious, and because coding is a kind of language that teaches patience and possibility. Mentoring him became one of the clearest joys I've had. We debugged simple games on my porch swing, and he asked the kinds of questions I used to be too exhausted to ask myself. Watching him get that spark, the one that says, "I can make this work," felt like paying forward the help Professor Cole once gave me. I didn't try to fix his parents, I taught him how to make small, consistent choices. That felt more useful than any lecture about morality. He learned to track variables and ask why a loop stopped working, and in doing so he learned a small truth about life. Steady effort changes outcomes more reliably than drama. The house became more than a trophy. It became a place people chose to come to because it was safe, not because they expected to take something from me. Friends who knew my story offered quiet congratulations. Mia and I hosted potlucks where mismatched neighbors brought simple dishes and real stories. Professor Cole visited with home-baked bread and reminded me how small acts of kindness have oversized returns. I sat on the porch at night and walked through rooms that used to belong to my hunger and now held warmth. That kind of quiet pride is deeper than spectacle. It is the knowledge that you built walls that protect what is worth protecting. Owning this house at 33 felt like something more than hitting a number in a bank account. It felt like reclaiming the parts of me that were taught to be invisible. I slept in a car at 19 and learned to be hard enough to survive but soft enough to accept help. That tension taught me how to draw lines, who I would love and how I would do it. My worth wasn't a ledger to be balanced by other people's choices. It was a thing I could grow with work, kindness, and boundaries. The life I built reflects the man I chose to be: imperfect, stubborn, and committed to making family mean something different than it had when I was young. I am a man who tells this story because the mess of it felt like a map, and maybe someone listening will find the road out of their own parking lot night.